All right, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Mountain Ridge Church Online. I'm really glad to be with you here this morning in your living room as you sit on your recliner here another Sunday on YouTube. But I'm pretty excited about where things are going today. If you've been with us through the summer, you know we've been kind of walking through the Old Testament. And today I get to kick off what's going to be a couple of weeks where we're studying the life of David. And we're going to do that in a pretty fun way. Today I'm going to talk about the process or the time between David's anointing to where he became king. And it kind of leads us into a discussion that's going to be a really big deal because I think we need to see things for what they are and the process that goes on in our lives. And I'm just kind of going to start by sharing my heart a little bit. You know, I don't know what's been going on with me lately, and maybe it's just part of getting older or something, but I found myself in a spot lately where I can't seem to look at my life or my children or just different things without seeing like all of it. You know, don't worry, I'm going to explain that a little bit. Like a couple of weeks ago, my daughter finally had the opportunity to graduate high school to walk, and Northern did a great job of giving us that opportunity, you know, in this pandemic and everything. But as I sat there watching her in her cap and gown, and they called her name, and I just watched this young woman walk across the stage to get her diploma where my little girl was supposed to be, you know? And I just saw all of her life at the same time. I saw all the ups and the downs and all that she had done and all that she's becoming and all that she has walked through in life and in those school years. And, you know, it's a bit overwhelming, but it's beautiful. And it seems to be the way I'm seeing everything right now. I can't seem to see it any other way. I see all of it at once. You know, I see my sons and they're out mowing my grass on my lawnmower or driving my cars or running faster and farther than I ever could. And it's the same thing. I see all of their lives at once. You know, they walk by me and they're every bit as tall as I am, if not taller. I got to get on my tiptoes to make sure that I still got them. And as I look at my sons, I just see all of their lives up until this point. I see it all happening at once, and it's stunning. I see the entire process, not just the moment. Last week, it was the same thing. You know, I was down in Philadelphia for my youngest daughter, Sydney's tournament. She had a soccer tournament, first one in a long time. We were all very excited. And, you know, I just enjoyed that so much. And she played so well. And she's now old enough to be playing on the big field. It's 11v11. So in soccer, as you get older, the field gets bigger, more players are added to it. So now she's at the point where it's as big and there's as many kids out there as there's going to be all the way through adulthood. And I'm sitting there watching all that. And I just couldn't help but seeing all of that process of her life. You know, like I can still see the little girl that would run around out there with a big smile on her face and couldn't even get the ball through her legs to do some of the cuts and turns because the ball was bigger than those little legs could be, you know. And I sat there and watched these games, and I was thinking about all the decisions that I tried to make, you know, to help her, put her in the spot that she could be the best Sydney she could be out there on the soccer field. And I still can see her running around with a practice penny that hangs down past her knees as she runs around the practice field. And it's overwhelming to see how far she's come. And in those moments, watching that beautiful girl play, I just couldn't help but see all of it all at once. And I wonder where you're at with stuff like that. Are you seeing like the whole process all at one time? Or do you just kind of see the end result or like that exact moment? See, it's a beautiful thing when you can take in the entire process. It can be overwhelming. I'm not going to lie to you. It can be overwhelming, but it can change your perspective of a lot of things. You know, it's like having somebody work on their home, right? And turn it into something special over time, right? And they work and they work on that home for years to get it to the place that they want it to be. And for years, the house has been torn to pieces, and the blood, the sweat, the tears, the sacrifices they make, the working at night after going to work at day to get their home the way they want it to be. And then they get it finished, right? And they want to have people over. They want them to see this beautiful home that they've put together. And they have people over who walk around and think, what? Wow, it must be nice to have this house. Wish I lived here. Aren't these people so lucky to have this beautiful home? Well, yeah, we all want the nice home, but not everybody's all that willing to work and sacrifice and take the time and energy to get that home to that place where we'd all want it to be. This happens in so many aspects of life. You know, 20 years ago, Mountain Ridge Church was a calling in Ken's heart, and today we have a church building. I'm standing in it right now, you know, and we've planted a second church in the Heidlersburg, Adams County area, And some people could look at all that and say, wow, it must be nice to be them, to be in that spot, while discounting the process, without ever realizing the ups and the downs and the pain and the happiness, the blood and the sweat and the tears that took us to get to this spot today. So I could go on, but we need to get into our story today. We need to talk about this. So I'll back off a bit, but I wanted you to begin to think this way. I want you to see the whole process, because I think it's often overlooked in life, and it's an important thing to see in our study today. So we're going to be looking at David. And David's a big deal. Like, if you've been in your Bible at all, you've probably seen or read about David at some point. We read about him all through Scripture. We see his amazing stories. We see his writings and his songs and his poetry and all the great things that David has accomplished in his life, right? David is a warrior. He's a real life superhero. Like, he has warriors who would do anything for him, and he's an amazing king. Like, he is the giant slayer. People adored him. Men followed him. And I think it can be easy to look at David sitting on the throne as this powerful king and just think, must be nice to be that guy. Wish I was that lucky to sit on that throne. But I want you to see what made David all of those things. Because to me, it goes back to what we were talking about. It's the process of his life. We have to see all of David's life and how he lived it to get a greater understanding of why he was such an awesome warrior king. We need to understand the process. We need to see all of it. And I think as we do and start to see all of it, our perspective can change, and it will change. So let's go back to last week. If you remember, Ken was talking to us about Saul. Now, Saul was the first king of Israel, and I think he can get a bit of bad rap. I kind of feel bad for Saul at times. The poor guy, he wasn't exactly jumping up and down trying to be king. Like, he was made king and kind of thrown into this thing. They never had a king before. He didn't have like an instruction manual to go off of, but we see some things about Saul that were really interesting. Saul was struggling with people pleasing, right? And eventually he oversteps God, trying to keep people happy, and he's pulled off the throne by God, right? And then on top of all that, this has to be difficult. He's got this young guy, David, around that everybody loves. It's just driving him crazy. And Ken showed us something really important in that talk about Saul, that he wasn't fully surrendered to God. And because of that, things didn't exactly go well. I loved Ken's talk, and if you didn't read it or see it yet, please go back and check it out. It was such a good talk to get into, and I think it was so helpful for us to see the importance of living a life fully surrendered to God and the freedom that we can have in life when we do that, right? So we saw last week that Saul messed up, and God came to Samuel and says it's time to find a new king. And I want you to remember what the Lord said to Samuel. So that was 1 Samuel 15, starting in verse 10. It says this: "Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel, I am grieved that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions." Samuel was troubled, and he cried out to the Lord all that night. See, it's at that moment that God sends Samuel looking for a new king, one who would not turn away from him. He's looking for a king who would actually carry out his commands, which leads Samuel to the house of Jesse to find this next king and anoint him. And we see this in 1 Samuel 16, verse 1. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." So this is an interesting moment, and Samuel's heading out to do exactly what God asked him to do. But he knows this isn't going to make Saul happy. He's a little worried about it, but he's going to go do what God asked him to do. And he comes to the house of Jesse, and we see something really interesting here as Samuel goes through Jesse's sons looking for the next great king. And I think we're going to find the key to what we're looking for in David's life found in here. So check this out. 1 Samuel 16, verse 6. When they arrived, and this is Jesse's family, Samuel took one look at Eliab and thought, "Surely this is the Lord's anointed." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Then Jesse told his next son to step forward and walk in front of Samuel, but Samuel said, "This is not the Lord's chosen either." Next, Jesse summoned Shemaiah, but Samuel said, "Neither is this one the Lord's chosen." In the same way, all 7 sons of Jesse were presented to Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any of these." Then Samuel asked, "Are these all of your sons that you have?" And Jesse replied, "There is still a youngest one, but he's out in the fields watching the sheep and goats." "Send for him at once," Samuel said. "We will not sit down and eat until he arrives." So Jesse sent for him. He was dark and handsome with beautiful eyes. And the Lord said, "This is the one. Anoint him." So as David stood there among his brothers, Samuel took the flask of olive oil he had brought and anointed David with the oil. And the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on. Then Samuel returned to Ramah. So I want you to see something here. This is a very different selection of king than what happened the first time, right? I mean, if you think about who Saul was for a moment. If you go to 1 Samuel 9, there's some interesting little details we can see about Saul, right? In verse 1 and 2, it says this: "There was a wealthy, influential man named Kish from the tribe of Benjamin. His son Saul was the most handsome man in Israel, head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the land." I think this is important to see. If you think about it, God was not happy that the children of Israel were rejecting him as king and wanting their own king like the other nations around them have. Remember that? We talked about it 2 weeks ago, where we were looking at this idea that God's not real happy that they don't want him to be their king anymore. So they want to find a king like everybody else has. So what does God do? He gives them one, just like the one that they would probably see and say, you know what, this guy should be king. And I find this really interesting. God gives them the king that they would want. He's the guy that's the tallest, the strongest, he's the best looking, he's got a wealthy father who's very influential named Kish, and this would make sense to them, right? And it's interesting because now God's going to put the king in place that he wants. Samuel's sent to the house of Jesse, and what's he do? He takes one look at the oldest son and thinks, oh, it's got to be this guy, another big, strong guy that would look right to human eyes. But but Samuel's wrong, right? And it's what God says next that I think is the key. And this is what we're going to come back to a lot today in verse 7. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." This is it, right? The Lord says, I don't see things the way you see them. People see all the flash and all the outward stuff, but God looks at the heart. And what's really interesting is how opposite Saul and David are right from the start. I mean, David isn't even invited to meet Samuel, right? He's out in the field taking care of the sheep. He's the youngest. He's doing the serving thing. He's not even in the question of whether or not he's going to be able to accomplish this, yet he is God's anointed. And it's this heart that we will come back to time and time again. So I want you to see something here. David is anointed to be king. This isn't a small thing, right? Like, imagine someone coming to you right now, coming to your home and saying, you know what? You're going to be the next great leader of the United States of America. Like, what would you do? Like, how would you react? Like, wouldn't you have a lot more questions? I mean, I would, right? Like, when is this all going to happen? But you know what David does? He goes back to the fields. He goes back to tending sheep and serving his family, and also begins serving Saul. You know, the guy he is supposed to be replacing someday. This is really interesting. In 1 Samuel 16, we see this. At the very moment, so the Spirit of the Lord is poured into David. It's also leaving Saul. Check this out. At the very moment, the Spirit of God left Saul, and in its place, a black mood sent by God settled on him. He was terrified. Saul's advisors said, "This awful, tormenting depression from God is making your life miserable. Oh, Master, let us help. Let us look for someone who can play the harp. When the black mood from God moves in, he'll play his music and you'll feel better." Saul told his servants, "Go ahead, find me someone who can play well and bring them to me." One of the young men spoke up. "I know someone. I've seen him myself, the son of Jesse of Bethlehem, an excellent musician. He also is courageous, of age, well-spoken, and good-looking, and God is with him." So Saul sent messengers to Jesse requesting, "Send your son David to me, the one who tends the sheep." Jesse took a donkey, loaded it with a couple loaves of bread, a flask of wine, and a young goat, and sent his son David with it to Saul. David came to Saul and stood before him. Saul liked him immediately and made him his right-hand man. Saul sent word back to Jesse, thank you, David will stay here. He's just what I'm looking for. I'm very impressed by him. After that, whenever the bad depression from God tormented Saul, David got out his harp and played. That would calm him down. So let me ask you something. You've been anointed the next king. Like, the greatness is all in front of you. You've been told of what's to come. How do you respond? What do you do next? See, I think this heart of God that God was looking for is really showing up in David's actions. David doesn't force it. He doesn't go out and start a rebellion against Saul and try to supplant him right away as king. David went back to the fields, and he humbly served his family. He eventually is brought to Saul, and he serves this king honorably and to the best of his ability, rising through the ranks to eventually become the armor bearer of Saul, which is a really big deal back in those days. Is this what you would do? See, David knows he is to be king, but it doesn't happen right away. In fact, it takes around 15 years for David to become king, and at that point, it's not of the whole nation of Israel. It's only of part of it. He doesn't unite the kingdoms for another 22-ish years. So that's a lot of time, right? It takes 22 years of serving, working, ups and downs, over 2 decades of pain and challenges before he would sit on that throne to have people look at him in that spot and say, it must be nice to be David up there with that crown on his head. And it takes us back to that picture that I was trying to paint for you as we started this talk today. When we look at the process of David's life, that puts him in the place that everyone wants it to be, that leadership spot. We see something else, don't we? Someone that, to be that leader, you have to earn it, to be the person that warriors would die for, that everyone would follow. I mean, David was the man, the warrior of all warriors, a real-life superhero, but what made him this way was that process of life, that heart of God that was in him, that was coming out in everything that he did. It was undeniable. You'd see him and see God in him by what he was doing, not necessarily by what he was saying or by what spot he was in or pushing towards. He wasn't. He was out humbly serving. So I think this process is a big deal, and it goes back to who he was on the inside. Remember what God said about this new king and what he was looking for, right? It was verse 7 when it said, the Lord said to Samuel, don't judge by his appearance or height, for I've rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Let's focus on that last sentence a minute. People judge by the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So when you hear of David, you might immediately think of some of the great moments of his life. You think about him killing Goliath or some of his amazing writings. But if you notice, that's not what God starts with. God starts with who David is. And later in Scripture, like in Acts, we actually see God describing David this way. I love this. Acts 13, verse 22. But God removed Saul and replaced him with David, a man whom God said, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything that I want him to do. So God calls David a man after his own heart. And this is the key. And this is what I wanted you to see, because it's this heart that's on full display as David waits over 2 decades to become that king that Samuel told him he would be 22 some years before that. It's this heart that makes David worthy of the leadership and the throne. It's this heart that allows the warrior to become a king that people would follow, because they're watching this heart come out in his life. And when we can look at that whole process and not just one moment, I think we see something really important about David and frankly, some things that we can apply to our own lives today too. See, so many people are looking for leadership spots, right? So many people want titles. They look at someone in a spot and think, man, I wish I could be like them, right? With all those warriors that follow, like, I want that. I want those people that are willing to die for me too. Like that'd be an amazing thing, but they don't realize what it takes to get there. They're only looking at the end result and wanting that, but probably aren't so willing to walk through what you have to walk through to get to that place. They look at the king and the crown and the power and the flash, but they aren't thinking through 22 years of serving, of humbly and quietly doing the right thing, of fleeing for his life from a jealous King Saul who wants to kill him, of never pushing for the spot that this is the heart of God coming out of David in all that he was. And it's important to look at the entire process. Do you want to be like David? Do you want to be a man or woman who leads and is successful in life? Do you want to be the kind of person that is blessed the way that David is? Do you want people to follow your leadership the way people followed David? Well, it starts with your heart. It starts with you and God and what's going on the inside. It doesn't start with the success or the position or the title. It doesn't start the day that you're the leader or by what you say. It starts in the depths of who you are as a person and how you're living your life. This is what made David so amazingly successful over time. It was how he lived his life as a man after God's own heart. And I wanted you to see something today. We can be described as these types of people too. So let's think about it some. What would it look like for you to live as a person after God's own heart? I think that could be a pretty long discussion, and I've thought about it a little bit, and I think I can bring it back to one or two sentences that I think we can apply to our lives today. I think what that would mean, to be a man or woman after God's own heart, would mean that you were described as a person who lives a life of love. Now, David, the warrior king, lived a life of love. Yes, strong, ferocious, giant-slaying David with so much blood on his sword that he can't even build the temple later, right? So he's going to have to leave that for his son to do, lived a life of love. And we think that love is for softies, right? But no, actually, it's quite the opposite, right? And I want you to see this. God says David was a man after God's own heart, and we know something about God, right? We know that God is love, right? In 1 John 4, I'll read verse 7 and verse 16. It says this, "Dear friends, let us continue to love one another, for love comes from God. Anyone who loves is a child of God and knows God." Verse 8, "But anyone who does not love does not know God, for God is love." At verse 16, it says, "God is love, and all who live in love live in God, and God lives in them." God is love. And to live this life of love is to live out a life after God's own heart, just like David did. David's a ferocious warrior. He's a passionate worshiper of God. And we need to see the reason he was so successful was the fact that he lived out this heart of God, this life of love. And I was thinking about this, like, what does that life look like? Well, Paul tells us in the love chapter, what we call the love chapter in 1 Corinthians 13. Paul says this, "Love is patient, love is kind, it doesn't envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it is not rude, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres." You know, it's really interesting. God is love, and David is a man after this heart of love. And as you look at how Paul describes love, those different attributes of love, and you lay them against David's life, we can realize that he's basically describing David as he's writing this stuff out. I mean, this is really interesting because we don't always tie warriors and kings to the love chapter that we like to read at weddings, right? But you need to see this and think about those different adjectives. Like, they're tough. They take strength. And you got to bring that to people in it. This is what a warrior would do. This is what inspired people about him. This is what made him the great leader. It wasn't what he told people he was. It was who he was and how he lived his life. And I want you to see this. In verse 4, Paul says, "Love is patient, love is kind, it doesn't envy, it doesn't boast, it's not proud." Well, what did we see in David's life? He's anointed to be king and then waits over 22 years for that all to come to fruition. You know, during that time, he's not envying Saul, like he's serving him. And he isn't proud. He just humbly serves his family out in the fields. He's taken food to his brothers off at war. He even gives his best to Saul, regardless of what he's getting back from Saul. You know, the man that he's about to replace at some point here. In verse 5, Paul says, "Love's not rude, it's not self-seeking, it's not easily angered, and it keeps no record of wrongs." So we know this about David. You know, he's not out there self-seeking. Now, because he's doing what God asked him to do, it definitely brings attention, but it's not something he's searching for. Not by, and I think that's an important thing to see. It's through his service and his faith in the Lord that people are starting to take notice, but they're seeing God in him coming out of him. And another thing we need to see is he certainly isn't easily angered. I mean, he certainly keeps no record of wrongs. I mean, every time Saul chucks a spear at him, he just comes back and serves him again. If he kept records of wrong, he probably kills him in that cave when Saul's in there going to the bathroom and he has a chance to do so. He doesn't, right? He just continues to do the right thing. In verse 6, Paul says, love doesn't delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. David delights in the Lord. We see it all through the book of Psalms, right? All of his writings. It doesn't mean, and one thing about David you need to know, it doesn't mean he doesn't fall to sin from time to time. He has his issues too, but he doesn't delight in evil. He focuses on and rejoices in the truth. And this becomes very clear all through his Psalms and his poetry. In verse 7, we see this: love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Well, that's who David is, right? He is the protector. He trusts in the Lord. He hopes in the Lord. He perseveres through so much. See, it's very clear to me that this warrior King David lives a life of love. This is a man after God's own heart. It's what made him so successful. This is what put him in the spot that everyone looked up to. And I wanted you to see that this is all about centering on God and then actually allowing his love to pour into us and out of us in such a way that it's coming out in our actions. See, it's interesting. People loved David. People served his leadership. Warriors were willing to die to protect this man. He rose to power at a level and favor at a level with God that no one's ever seen before. The promises that God made him will flow into generations to come, which is an unbelievable thing. But I wanted you to see something. That all starts with his heart. It started with who he is on the inside. It wasn't always flashy. It was a life focused on and centered on God. It was what was going on the inside that no one but him and God knew about that made him who he was. It was all those days out in the fields, in the pastures, tending to his father's sheep and spending time with his heavenly Father in those moments. See, the key was his heart. It was him living this life of love. This is what people saw. It's what drove Saul crazy for a while. This is what had warriors willing to follow him. They watched it for 22 years, building to this point. Remember, this is so important. What God said to Samuel as he looked through Jesse's sons for the next great king in verse 7. The Lord said to Samuel, don't judge by his appearance or height, for I've rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. As I've walked through life lately, I was telling you when we got started today, I just can't help but see, the whole process of what's going on around me. And I'm finding that beautiful and a bit overwhelming and just amazing. It's hard for me to walk into this church building and not think about, what all's gone down in the process that's got us here over 20 years of ups and downs and good times and painful times that have led us to these spots where we're planting churches and having such a great time here at MRC. A couple weeks ago, watching Monica walk across the stage and get her diploma from Principal Lehman, I couldn't help but see all of her life, that led her to that point. And it's amazing. I look at my children and I just can't get over how they've grown and think about all the process and all the development and all the ups and downs along the way. And I think it's a better way to look at life. I think in so many ways, the more time I spend with God, the more he's opening my eyes up to this entire process, rather than just seeing these specific moments. And I think it can raise our level of gratitude and worship and just appreciation for what's going on around us. I think it changes our perspectives. And I think when we look at David's life and we really realize there's 22 years there waiting to be the great king of Israel, it can change how we see things there too in a really good way. So many people look at David and say they would love to be a king or a queen sitting on the throne and running the show, right? Many would say they would love for people to respond to them the way people responded to David and his leadership, right? They want all that, but they aren't willing to walk through all that pain, all those wars and fights and battles, the good stuff and the challenges that took place over those 22 years or so to get to that spot. So are they living with the kind of character and love needed to be in that spot? I wanted you to see this today. That while we don't see things the way God does, there's a reason that people follow David. And it's because they saw a person living after God's own heart. They might not have been able to just identify it that consciously, but they saw it. They saw who he was over time, and they would follow that anywhere. It's easy to want to spot. It's a whole other thing to live the life necessary, live the life of love necessary to earn that spot over time. So I'm going to close down by just asking you a couple questions today. If you were anointed king and told of all your greatness to come, could you be patient and wait on God's timing, or would you try to force that a bit? If you were anointed king and told of your greatness to come, would you humbly serve your family? Would you head back out into the fields to do the menial task, to tend the sheep, knowing that you're going to be great someday? Or would you be looking another direction? Could you serve the leader that you would someday you're going to replace the way David served Saul? Or would you try to push past that leader and take that spot that God has promised you? Would you serve others? Or would you expect others to serve you? Could you remain faithful even when so much time passed? 22 years is a long time, right? Could you remain faithful even with all that time passing? Or would you begin to question God's calling over time? I want to ask you this, and I want you thinking about this. Would you be described as a person after God's own heart? And could you be described that way? Do you live this life of love? If you don't know how to answer that last one, can I tell you something? Look at how you're living, because your actions are actually answering that for you. Remember what Paul told us about love. Love is patient. Love is kind. It doesn't envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. So I wanted you to see something special today. I think it's really important. David has a lot of big, amazing moments, a lot of headliners, right? Like a lot of things that we think about when we see David's life. But I think it's important to see what God saw in him. It's important to remember the process that it took to put him on that throne, not just the moment that he sat down on it. What made David great was the fact that he lived a life of God, after God's own heart, a life of love, which means that you and I, we can be like David. We can have God in us and have this life of love in us too. And it starts by centering on and submitting to God and his will for our lives. And when you do, people will see you. They will see God coming out of your life in the way that he came out of David's. And over time, you'll have this beautiful process to look back on too. So I got to tell you something. This message meant a lot to me. I hope it meant something to you too. This week, I'm going to kind of close with telling you that I'd like you to come back and hang out with me some this week. What we're going to do for the 4 days is look at different Psalms that David wrote in the times when he was waiting to become king. I thought it'd be kind of neat to look at how he felt and where he was at, and we can see that in some of these Psalms. So I'll see you tomorrow, and we'll get into the first Psalm. It'll be Psalm 7, looking at kind of what was going on while David was waiting to be king. We love you. I hope you have a great week.